beginning, they were labeled as a bunch of traitors. They spent most of their time in various Pakistani jails. The authorities did not want these leaders to be in constant contact with their people. But the people never failed to demonstrate their total support for the leadership, and this fact has greatly irked the rulers. As a result, they decided to punish the people by launching a series of military operations, killing thousands of innocent men, women, and children. Balochistan, in all intent and purposes, has been transformed into a colony. Its natural resources have been plundered with brazen impunity. Although rich in natural resources, Balochistan is the poorest province in Pakistan. However, nothing, but absolutely nothing, has been done to improve the lot of the people. Both Pakistani and Iranian rulers are intent upon brutalizing the Baloch with absolutely no respect for basic human rights. With the increase in rulers' violence, the resistance has also been getting stronger and stronger day by day. Because of the sheer intransigence of the rulers and their tyrannical policies, the Baloch people have been left with no option but to struggle for complete independence. By the 60s and 70s of the last century, Baloch modern poetry finally came of age. As is well known, poetry reflects the reality of life. Balochi poetry, therefore, should be considered and judged against this historical background, because since the very ancient times, whenever the Baloch are mentioned in history, they appear to be fighting either for their survival or to defend their homeland. Balochi poetry has its origin in the 16th century. This poetry has come down to us thanks to the oral tradition of the minstrels and other poetry lovers. This early period is considered to be the classical period of Balochi poetry. Alas, the poets who produced such exquisite poetical wonders remain totally anonymous. Perhaps their work was thought to be more important than their identity because it served the purpose of continuing the tribal traditions. The 16th century Balochistan was a strictly tribal society where the poet assumed a special place in the tribal hierarchy. His words were thought to be the most effective means to rallying around the whole tribe, especially at the time of war or times of war. Poets not just composed poetry, but they also took part in all the affairs of the tribe, including fighting the enemies in the battlefields. They were so venerated that according to the Baloch Code of Honor, if captured in the battlefield, they would like women, children, and old and unarmed people, be spared even by the most vicious of enemies. Poets, by the very nature of their craft, are free spirits. Even in a strictly regimented tribal setup, we find poets who had supra-tribal and national outlook. They opposed the absurdity of the tribal feuds. The post-16th century Balochi poetry has the same characteristics as that of the earlier period. The main themes of this poetry were tribal wars, the beauty of nature, romantic pursuits, and chivalry. As mentioned earlier, the Baloch have been historically always fighting one enemy or another. Naturally, their poetry also reflects this reality. Balochi poetry has been traditionally divided into two distinct parts, namely love poems and war poems. The Balochi poetry has been traditionally divided into two distinct parts, love poems. The Baloch poets did not just compose poems about war and battles, but produced a vast body of beautiful love poems. However, some of these poets dealt with the subjects equally successfully in single compositions. For them, love and war were the same sides were two sides of the same coins. In the 19th century, the poetic scene was dominated by the mullahs. Unlike the Arabic meaning of the word, a mullah up until early years of the 20th century meant simply a person who could read and write, hence an educated person. Small wonder that we find a large number of Arabic and Persian words introduced in the poetry of this period. There were some great mullah poets, among them Mullah Fazl, who is considered to be the greatest poet of this period. He wrote about love and war in equal measures. With the advent of the 20th century and the spread of modern political ideas, new innovations were introduced in Balochi poetry, both in content as well as in form. The end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century produced three great poets, namely Mullah Fazl, who has already been mentioned, Mustaqli and Ramali Murray. The latter was fiercely anti-British and a true defender of his people and country. He composed long poems in which he gave minute details of battles fought against the British. Ramali eulogizes war. For him, war is the only means through which the Baloch could liberate themselves and their country. Mustaqli in contrast held completely opposite views. As a poet with mystic inclinations, he hated war, which is quite uncharacteristic of a Baloch poet. Although he abhorred the foreign occupiers, he was too preoccupied with the idea of universal love. Hence, his dislike of war in any shape or form. The period between 30s and 50s of the last century were the formative years of the modern Balochi poetry. As has been mentioned before, poets have always been regarded as vanguards and defenders of the people in Baloch society. But on this very occasion, probably have mentioned those instances. The national rather than tribe, they produced a kind of poetry which was national rather than tribal. Armed with the modern ideas, they took an active part in the political struggle of their people, first against the British colonialists and later against the occupation of their land by Pakistan. Of these early poets, 4 of them became very famous, namely Muhammad Hussain Anka, Gul Khan Nasir, Sayyid Hashmi, and Azad Jamaldini. Of these, Anka and Nasir were actively involved in the political struggle. As a result, they were imprisoned numerous times, first because of the British and then the Pakistani authorities. Like the modern Palestinian poetry, the Balochi poetry can be defined as the poetry of struggle and resistance. Because of the wanton violence unleashed on the people, there is not a single poet in Balochistan who has not chosen this path, the path of resistance. Even the most inward-looking of them have produced at least one, if not several, such works. The modern Balochi poet can be characterized as a blend of classical tradition, Qazi Nazrul Islam, Mahmud Darwish, and Faiz Ahmad Faiz. The list of the poets who were committed to resistance is very long. We mention here only the most prominent of them, such as Gul Khan Nasir, Muhammad Hussain Anka, Azad Jamaldini, Karim Dashti, Siddiq Azad, G.R. Mullah, Majid Gwadari, Bashir Bedar, Mubarak Qazi, Ghulam Hussain Shawaz, Allah Bakhsh Bozdar, Munir Momin, Ismail Mumtaz, Sabah Dashtiyari, Zafar Ali Zafar, Fazal Khalik, Major Majid, Ali Isa, Mumtaz Yusuf, and Razak Nader. I would have loved to cite here some representative examples of this poetry, but unfortunately, apart from 2 collections of poetry, I would have loved to cite a few representative examples of this poetry, but unfortunately, apart from 2 collections of poetry, I do not have books by other poets. Thank you very much for